So hello and a warm welcome to another HEIRNET History and Citizenship Education Keynote. I'm Roland Bernhard, History Education Researcher at the Universities of Vienna and Salzburg, and I'm hosting the keynote series. Again, researchers and history educators from all over the world are gathered to participate in our third keynote about knowledge in history education. We are now 108 people. I just let in a few people from the waiting room. And I'm very happy that Andreas Körber from the University of Hamburg is here with us today and will speak to us in a minute. To today's program. First, Andreas Körber will give his presentation for about 30 minutes. Please write down your questions. After the talk, you will have the opportunity to post them into the chat. I will read out the questions loud and Andreas Körber will answer them. After this, we will have breakout sessions for half an hour until 9 o'clock Central European time and 8 o'clock British summertime, and the official program will be over. However, you can stay in the meeting and chat with colleagues as long as you want in the breakout rooms. If you may have noticed, we are recording the keynote talk and we will post an edited version of each keynote on the HEIRNET website and the HEIRNET YouTube channel. The video of the keynote with Carla von Boxtel from April is already available on our HEIRNET YouTube channel. I'll send a link into the chat. Please watch the video, subscribe to the channel, like, and you may also want to leave a comment. All this will help HEIRNET. So there is another thing. If you want to receive information about the HEIRNET keynote and the HEIRNET conference, you might want to sign up here with your name, your organization, your email address, and we will send you information about the keynote and the conference. I will again post a link into the chat. Now to today's keynote. I'm very happy to introduce Andreas Körber from the University of Hamburg to you. Andreas is very well known in the German-speaking world since he's one of the founding fathers of the Für-Kompetenz model, which has become extremely popular in many German states and also in my home country in Austria. It is a model that influenced curricula. So for example, in Austria, all history teachers have to teach according to this model, and all history textbooks had to introduce it in the last 13 years. The Für model has a strong focus on competences, and some argue that it neglects somehow historical knowledge. So it's great to have you here, Andreas, to ask you in person what you think in this respect. The title of Andreas' talk will be Knowledge and or Incompetences of Historical Thinking, a German Perspectives. Two more sentences about Andreas. Andreas Körber is Professor of Education with special regards to history and political education at the Hamburg University. He was a teacher before taking up his professorship in 2004. His research covers theoretical and empirical research into historical thinking, historical consciousness, and historical thinking competences. And he has published a wide range of books and articles to many topics regarding to history education research. Andreas, the stage is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much, Roland, for the kind introduction. Can you hear me, everybody? Is it, Roland, is it okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
And also camera works, because I don't see it myself.
Yes,
okay,
we can see.
Thank you very much. And especially for this opportunity, I really feel honored to be among the first 3 speakers within this series. I don't know whether I will live up to it, but let's see. You just read the title of my talk. I called it A German Perspective, not the German Perspective, and that on purpose, because I will not just give an overview over German or the German understanding of knowledge, but will point to some questions. You just hinted to one, whether to the relation between competencies and knowledge. And also I will try to develop this a bit further. It might be a bit theoretical, and I have a lot of graphs. Some have been done even today. So what will I do? Okay, now, first I will do a few words about the background of the whole discussion in Germany by way of an introduction. I will tell a bit about competency orientation in German history education, roughly from 2003 on. Then I will take up some differentiations of what knowledge can be by some colleagues, which will help me in my further development. And I will ask myself and yourself about the provenances of knowledge and the relational character of knowledge, which is a point which I want to push a bit today. And finally, or just before the concluding remarks, I want to turn to the question of levels and progression in knowledge education, or in covering knowledge, or developing knowledge in history education. And of course, some concluding remarks will close the thing. And the last slide, for those who want to view it afterwards, will have all the references, of course. So the background and introduction. The following will be a first graph, which I made today. I don't know whether it's really good, but this is it. It shows in a way, or it's meant to exemplify the traditional organization of history education in Germany. And the vertical is the historical time up. The uppermost part is today, and the lowest part is back then somewhere. And the x-axis is a learning progression in years. And so the traditional organization of history education was a chronological coverage of topics, all those blue and sometimes patterned boxes, following one after another and following each other chronologically, but not in a strict line, but switching between sections, sometimes cultural history, sometimes political history, economic history. So this is not really one line, and interspersed among it, after some discussion in the 70s, 80s, and especially 90s, there are sections which I try to put in here in the smaller boxes, which we call method boxes or method orientation. So this is often how to analyze sources, how to analyze a caricature, how to write a specific type of text. But in general, the history teaching is still, and in most curricula and in most textbooks, it is still a chronological coverage of the topics. Even though we have the odd longitudinal cut, Längsschnitt, as we call it, where one topic is followed across the times, and some curricula present or require 2 or 3 longitudinal cuts. Some have longitudinal cuts as the general structure in the upper secondary part, but in general, this chronological coverage has been very persistent, even though most of the topics are problem-oriented today, not only lectured, but they are explored, they are learned by inquiry, but still this general concept prevails. And also, even though we have since roughly 1977, since Historians Conference in Mainz, 1977, we have a focus on historical consciousness in history education. This did not overrule, but only modify this concept. So below this concept of a sequence of coverage of topics, there must be some idea of how to develop historical consciousness, or some ideas, there must be in the plural, among teachers and in textbooks, but they also did not do away with this chronological coverage. even in this time of historical consciousness orientation, we had a repeating debate in the disciplinary community on the relation between basic knowledge, or the general master narrative, and historical consciousness, or historical thinking, or historical argumenting. And this debate roughly always had the type of whether there is a knowledge first concept. Students have to know the basics first before they can argue, before they can think, or whether knowledge has to be developed in line with the development of concepts and categories. This is a standard repeating debate which we already had before, in roughly around the millennium switch, then more concrete around 2003. We had a shift in German educational policy and educational administration, and also education research, towards competencies. This is not something which is relevant for history only, but in all the subjects, this competency orientation was to be introduced officially only in the main subjects, German language and literature, the foreign languages and the sciences, but all other subjects also participated, some for fear of being downgraded if they had not competencies. So what are competencies? There is a standard, or most quoted, almost standard definition of competencies as the cognitive abilities and skills available in or learned by individuals to solve specific problems, as well as the associated motivational, volitional, and social dispositions and skills to use the problem solution successfully and responsibly in variable situations. This is a standard definition which is used in almost all the literature on competencies in the subject didactics by Franz Emanuel Weinert. And it combines abilities and skills with dispositions, motivations, volitions, and the ability and the readiness to really put them to the test or to use. So it's not abstract. A competence is only a competence if you can put it into practice. And if you put it into practice in a new situation, not in something which you have learned. And in most cases, this means if you want to test or to apply a competence, then it needs to have a new context. If you test some knowledge or some ability, some skill in the context which you have covered, then this would not qualify as a competence. So much for the background of this debate. And then most of the subject didactics developed models of how these competencies can be considered. And also the same for history. And since this was not a central program, there were several such competence models organized and developed and published. And I won't cover them all here, but I just want to make clear one separation, one distinction. Some of those formulated competencies as those abilities which students need to acquire and to develop in order to be successful in their subsequent schooling, school histories and tests, and others, as the Für model, but also that of Pandl, for example, conceptualized competencies as those abilities and skills which are needed outside school, in society, in later life. And this is something which really divides the competence models. And these competence models have quite different structure. And as I said, I won't cover them all, but I want to give some highlights or some insights into parts which are relevant to our topic. One of the first competence models was developed by Michael Sauer in 2002 already, and this was adopted later by the History Teachers Association in 2010 for their standards, which they proposed. And I don't want you to read this all. This is just a collection of the headings and of some of those definitions of sub-competencies or partial competencies. On the upper left hand, there are some lines which I printed in bold and even in color. And as you can see, within this competence model of Michael Sauer, there is a competence to know and be able to describe important events, developments, and structures, or to know causes and effects, and to know topic-related dates. This means in this competence model, classic knowledge, as you may call it, classic knowledge of events and people and developments is part of competencies. So to be able to know is a competency. And in a way, this competence model is a reformulation of the classic parts of history education before competence orientation in competence terminology. So almost all the aims of teaching are formulated in competence terminology in this model. And this kind of to know a specific event, specific development, specific structure, of course, does not meet the requirement by the HEIRNET definition, because this would not be transferable to another topic. So to be able to have some knowledge or to acquire knowledge or to be able to have some abstract knowledge would be would meet this this definition, but not the requirement to memorize a specific date or something like that. So that is one of the main points of criticism towards this model of competencies. There are lots more, but I'll keep it at that. The FÜR model, on the other hand, has a totally different idea of historical thinking and learning, and I won't present the whole model to you, as I understand that Roland sent out a paper with the call where you can see some of it and read up some of it. But the main idea is that historical thinking is a circular process of orientation in time. And starting at the bottom of the graph, I'm not sure whether you can see my my mouse pointer, I don't think so. At the bottom with a need for orientation, some kind of uncertainty, then a development of questions and concepts, then addressing source material, primary sources, and ready-made or formulated narratives. And from that to develop orientation, knowledge about how others see the past, and own a new made synthesis of concepts, of contexts. And from that you are have some better, maybe not finished, or most certainly not finished insight and orientation. Within this this model, which Wolfgang Hasberg and myself published in 2003, there are references to knowledge. And I circled those. You have knowledge which you have to activate in order to be able to address sources in a meaningful way. And by doing historical research or reading narratives and accounts and recounts, you also gain new knowledge. Those are the two red circles. And at the outcome of the whole process, there also is an outcome of knowledge, not only of abstract orientation, but you gain new knowledge about the past, about developments, and about your own position in it, because you yourself have a relation to this past when you develop knowledge in such a way. So From the bottom, there must be an arrow maybe to a point where you have knowledge about the past. I will come back to that. From this model, the dynamic model of historical consciousness, as we called it afterwards, nowadays we mostly say the process model, the Früher model was developed, and this is only to show it consists of 4 areas of competencies, and 3 of them along the circular way of historical thinking, and the blue one in the middle we called historical subject matter competence, in German Sachkompetenz. And this blue one is the one which will interest us today, because that one is not within the circle, but in the midst of it. And it contains knowledge. It contains knowledge, but not knowledge of the past, of specific persons, specific events, specific developments, but such knowledge which you can activate in order to frame questions to a new question, to a new topic, to a new problem, or which you can use for and activate and use in reading material, in identifying, for example, a narrative structure in an account, a kind of a narrative pattern. And of course, all the contents of this blue container in the middle, the subject matter competence container, are refreshed and developed once you are through the circle again. So this is a dynamic storage of a kind of knowledge. So that's why this orange circle is here in the middle. So far for the basics, for the foundation. Within the same time frame in the German debate, not only this maybe somewhat simple question of knowledge versus competences was debated, but a lot of colleagues also developed differentiations of knowledge, or used some which were in the literature either of general pedagogics or of other subjects. And I know Christoph Küberger is among us. He published a book on Wissen, knowledge, in 2012. And from that book, I want to use one contribution by 3 colleagues. Markus Bernhard, not Roland, Ulrich Meyer, and Peter Gautschi, author of another competence model. These 3 had an article in Christoph Küberger's book, and they used 2 differentiations of knowledge. On the left is the classic differentiation by Gilbert Ryle of 1948, which they presented, and on the right is another one which I think they developed themselves, and which will inform us a bit later on. But first to the left one, which sometimes still prevails today in the debate. The distinction of knowing what, declarative or maybe better propositional knowledge, knowing how, procedural knowledge, and knowing why, metacognitive knowledge, is not suitable for differentiating historical knowledge, either putting it in one of these categories or to distribute it clear-cut into different. I will come to that on the next slides. And the right differentiation will give a totally new and an additional concept. It distinguishes outward and inward, should I say, representation of knowledge or forms of knowledge. And I will come to that a bit later then also. So first to the Gilbert Ryle problem. As you can see on the right, I have this, this blue container, and the question is there a way of putting historical knowledge into this, or selecting historical knowledge for this container for competencies by the Gilbert-Ryle model? And the answer would be no. And already Bernhard Meyer and Gauci stated that neither of these three categories captures the nature of historical knowledge. And I want to exemplify that a bit. I have listed some ways, some forms of historical knowledge I could think. I could find here in the middle. For example, you have knowing past events, past people, past actions and processes, knowing individual strategies in the past also. Actions, strategies, maybe that one of Napoleon at Waterloo, knowing how to reenact as someone in the past. This is a kind of knowledge. But also general insights into the course of history or what history is about, whether history exemplifies human nature or whether it shows us progress, or even zero and first order concepts, the terminology of the time in question or modern terminology for referring to past events or past concepts. And then, of course, you have knowledge also about how to gain information and knowledge and how to structure and categorize history, how to distinguish different periods, how to communicate about history, how to assess and verify statements or claims, and of course also principles of historical epistemology and second order concepts. You can all know them. And the interesting thing is that knowing what is not only about knowing the past, but also the second order concepts and also the methods for gaining knowledge, or the periodization structures can be known in a declarative and propositional way, and they can be applied. That is, some of these knowledge types have two links to the Gilbert-Ryle distinctions. And not on knowing what is not about the past, the upper part of those, and knowing how is not only about our today's procedures, but also to know how I would act as if I was in the past. In a way, this reenactment would also be qualified as procedural knowledge. So if I want to have competencies and I want to answer the question of whether knowledge is part of competencies, I have to distinguish between those in a different way. And of course, they are interlinked. I can't have past events and people, knowledge of past events and people, without any idea of periodization. So these are not strictly clear-cut, but they are also interlinked. I need knowledge of the one kind in order to not only to communicate, but to refer, even in my head, to other types of knowledge. So my suggestion would be that we have some kinds of knowledge which can be transferable, which can be used for historical thinking in new contexts, and some which can't. And I think this distinction makes a lot of sense in history education if you want to talk and think about the relation between knowledge and competency. So my claim would be that those which I marked in blue here are those types of knowledge which may form or which must form part of competencies, which belong into the concept of competencies. And that is not only skills, not only something mechanic, but it's about competencies which you can decide yourself about whether you apply them, or where you have the as the one who thinks, you have the entitlement to decide and to apply or not to apply. And that also is part of competences. So that was the first application of Markus Bernhard, Ulrich Meyer, and Peter Gauci's differentiations. The second one, which I showed on the right on their slide, brings us to another aspect of knowledge in history education: provenances and the relational character. In this distinction, they make up two domains of knowledge, maybe. One is the historical universe and the other the individuum, or as I would say, one is the outside, or in a way the societal, but then in the plural, the societal form of historical knowledge, and the individual, the internal form of historical knowledge. And both are tripartite in this model, but this is not as important for today. The historical universe is objectified in narratives, which can be formulated, which can be written down, which are in a way, even though not eternally, but can be stable. And they are formed from popular stories, from familial tales, and from academic historiographic narrations. And they form a kind of archived knowledge, of societally archived knowledge, in a way conventional knowledge, but always thought in the plural. It's not unified. And the individuum has concepts, ideas, and here you find the Gilbert-Ryle distinction in the model, and those form concepts and the personal foundation for dynamic historical knowledge. And these two realms of knowledge, they come together in historical thinking. And as the graph is here, these arrows only show towards historical thinking. I would say these must be double arrows. They go back, so that historical thinking is the procedure, the operation in which the societal knowledge, the conventional knowledge or knowledges about things past, and the individual forms of knowledge come together and re-inform each other. So the individual forms, through historical thinking, form new or confirmed or enriched narratives, as the historical universe informs the new and reformed or confirmed or enriched concepts of the individual. And concepts, I think, means here not only terms and abstract concepts, but also imagination about the past in a way. So this is a bidirectional function. And so individual and historic societal knowledge about the past are relational already here. And I think that is very important. If we take this for serious, and I think we should, historical learning is not going from the left to the right, from the outside into the individuum, but always is a kind of bidirectional interaction. I make a bracket, I open a bracket here. In a way, that is what Wolfgang Klafki in German educational theory already formulated in the 1950s and reformulated more often up to the 1980s, that education is about the mutual development or opening up, Erschließung in German, opening, not closing, but the other way around, opening up, the mutual opening up of the individuum and the world outside. And both gain from it. And this mutual process of education is in a way the same thing which we have here, and I'll come back to that on the next slide also. So this means that if history education and learning history and gaining knowledge is not just gaining knowledge from the outside into the inside, we can even put this a bit more complicated maybe, but even more valid. This graph is from Tilman Grammes, a Hamburg colleague in political education, from 1998, and it's my translation, I hope it's correct, but what he shows here is that there is no single outward archived knowledge and no single outside knowledge order, but different frames of society in the graph and different instances, different provenances. So you have occupational or institutional knowledge, you have scientific knowledge on the upper left, and you have everyday knowledge, life world knowledge on the below the triangle. And school knowledge, again, is in the middle. And school knowledge is not about getting the social science knowledge and eradicating the everyday knowledge. This would be the trivial version of conceptual change theory, but rather is about sequentially being enabled to interrelate them and to interrelate those knowledge orders which I have in my everyday life world and in the occupational or different contexts. And so school knowledge is not about, or school learning is not about gaining one form of knowledge and not just adding to it, but to be able to increasingly interrelate. So this kind of relational knowledge makes up the powerfulness of knowledge. In a way, this is what Michael Young in Powerful Knowledge postulates. Knowledge must take students from their life world focus across their borders into new horizons, so that they can link socially and explore new ways of meaning and develop themselves. And I think this is already grasped in this graph also. But it also means that academic knowledge is only one part for learning, and in our case for historical learning. It's not the basis for it. And so it should not be this academic knowledge first, and it should not be conveyed as is, but knowledge needs to be built internally on the right side of the Bernhard Meyer and Gauci graph, and then related in a related way. So I come to an interim conclusion. Competencies of historical thinking include knowledge of a certain kind. They are not the other of knowledge. They are not the alternative to knowledge, and competencies do not eradicate knowledge, or they should not eradicate knowledge. There were discussions, and some people even thought, oh, nowadays knowledge doesn't count anymore, but no, that would be a wrong consideration. But they include, competencies include a certain kind of knowledge, that knowledge which is transferable, which is applicable, and which in being transferable has its outside form, the way others know things, and its internal representation. Because only if I have these relational form of transferable knowledge, of concepts, of methods, of perspectives, only then can I relate to others. That's an aspect I'll come to in the next part. Other kinds of knowledge, specifically this knowledge about the past and the insights about the past, about the course of history, which Michael Sauer in his first competence model still counted into the competencies, and which I said, no, it's not part of competencies. They are valid and necessary, but they are not part of competencies. But both are complementing each other. And this complementing also is not only additive, but they need to be interrelated also. And none of these, the knowledge of the past or the case knowledge, as you might call it, or the transferable competency knowledge, has priority. They need to be interrelated also. Now I have a graph which is a bit complicated, so I give you a few minutes or a few seconds maybe to look at it. In the middle, you see this circular model of historical thinking again, with the one container of transferable knowledge, of categorical knowledge, and below it, this blue form is this knowledge about the past. So this shall exemplify one way, one person, one individual. And this individual does its historical thinking not in solitude or in confinement, but in society with others. And that's why all these are replicated, doing the same, and from different backgrounds, with different perspectives, with different interests. That's why I gave them different colors. I couldn't recolor the gray, unfortunately, but I hope you get it. And so that means this person is depending on doing their own historical orientation, their historical thinking, not in solitary confinement, because this person has to interact with the others in society. I am not really oriented about what it means to be a modern person, or what it means to be a European, to be a German, or to live in a former colonializing country. All these questions, I'm not fully informed if I do it for myself only. But I need to know about the orientations and the knowledge of others. That's what these networks or these spider webs shall indicate. And the same holds true for the conceptual knowledge within my competencies. I can only make use of what others think about history and about the results, but also about what concepts they apply, if I have some knowledge or some kind of interrelation to their knowledge. And so we have these double networks of compatible, not of unified knowledge. We don't need to have all the same kind of knowledge, but we need to have it interrelatable. I'll skip it. So that even though not all knowledge is part of competencies, it still is an important aspect. Competency models and knowledge form two of at least three dimensions of historical learning. Knowledge about the past has a function, and here I contradict a bit Carla van Boxtel in her own keynote, the last one. She said this knowledge is not has for itself, it's not self-contained, but it has a function. But yes, we also have a need for historical knowledge of the past, of this case knowledge type, because we have three dimensions of history education which we can distinguish. We need to develop insights, attitudes, perspectives onto the past. We might call this historical consciousness. We need to elaborate competencies of historical thinking, and we need to rebuild an internal historical universe and constantly rebuild it. So this case knowledge also is part of our historical orientation, and we don't only use it for our competencies, but we have to build a picture of the past a picture of what the past was about, and we need to be able to constantly rebuild it. And all three dimensions need to be developmental, so that we have maybe an initial type of doing this, and then we have more developed types. And so we have the question of levels and progression. Again, you might see this is the same graph as before, but on three levels. On the bottom, you see this network of people who do their historical thinking without any interconnection. I would call that a basic level. People on this level, maybe young students, do historical thinking. But if they are not able to interrelate with each other, they only can do it in confinement and in their own language and without making use of what has been thought before and what others think. And so a first development of historical learning, both on the competency and also on the knowledge, on the case knowledge dimension, would be the development of these networks. So here, the outside knowledge, the societal knowledge, represented by all the other individuals, and in this kind of archive, Bernhard, Meyer, and Gauci described, but this is not one singular archive. This archive is the multitude, the pluriverse of narratives and of concepts and of this outside knowledge for each other, for each individual person, is a necessary part to be part of it, to partake in it, so that others can understand myself, that I can make myself understandable to others, and I can understand others. I can make use of the internet, I can make use of a library. So I need not only my internally built version of it, but I must be able to relate it. In a way, this is a conventional form of knowledge. There must be one caveat here. This does not mean that on this first level, maybe of learning, students should learn to think conventionally, to think like all the others. Quite the opposite is true. They should do their individual thinking and their individual judging and their individual sense of meaning making, but they should learn to communicate this with others. So it's the form needs to be conventional, and they might need to be able to use the convention, but not to become conventional in their thinking, in their convictions. And on the upper level, I think this must be put one more way upward towards a way where these interconnections are not being taken for granted, but are themselves being reflected. So while on the intermediate level, we have the ability to interconnect via these shared or conventional concepts, on the elaborate level, we have the ability to reflect on these connecting concepts and maybe to contradict them, to develop them further. And this is also true for knowledge. The way we have knowledge must be not only combining or interlinking between people, but it must then progress to another level where we can reflect on what I would call knowledge with an index. Let's have an example. On the middle intermediate level, maybe we talk about the Middle Ages as if they were a given. And anyone who is able to talk about the Middle Ages, to use a search machine on the internet with the terms of Middle Ages, shows that he is on this level. But to be able to question what is contained in this Middle Ages concept, in this idea of Middle Ages, or in this idea of kingship or something, to reflect on that would be the upper level. So knowledge with an index.
Andreas, sorry for interrupting, but I have to make sure the time discipline.
Yes, so. I'm almost ready.
Okay.
Two more slides, I think.
Okay, so like 3 or 4 minutes.
So this is just a listing of what I just showed on the graph. On the left, you have the basic level where you have situated thinking, which is maybe still inconsistent in concepts and terminology and in ideas, and even have conflicting images of the past in different contexts. And the intermediate level then may be characterized by the ability to integrate different forms, but then to use knowledge and either conceptual knowledge or even also case knowledge in a strictly differentiated and ordered and sorted way. And the elaborate level would be this knowledge with an index. And I have one example, one very small example. This is about conceptual knowledge, about the concept of war, maybe. On the basic level, people might use very different words and terms and even concepts, very mixed and even changing from one day to the other, because they have not yet learned their differentiation. On the intermediate level, these should be sorted so that we can ask, is that the right concept to apply to this context? But if we keep it at that, people would take this as maybe as granted as a kind of representation of the truth. On an elaborate level, these concepts which we need would be applicable, or people would be able to put them to their own reflection. So, for example, the word feud here, we could ask whether this would be applicable in a modern context, even though it's a medieval one. What would it mean if we call something a feud, maybe between two football trainers or something? The word is used. We can reflect on it, or we can reflect on whether recent conflicts still can be used, grasped by the term of war. You all know the debate about the new wars, Maykalder and Herfried Münkler, and whether we need to differentiate our concept of war again. So this kind of reflective knowledge with an index, knowing I can apply a word, a concept, I can refer to a certain past, to an event, but I always think the development or the limits of its application. That would be the elaborate way. And so competence-oriented history education needs both kinds of knowledge, and these both kinds of knowledge need to be constructive and need to be relational. So individual and relational between groups and different provenances, institutionalized. And that means that knowledge cannot be conveyed and cannot be given in formulated chunks, and maybe even cannot be tested by asking whether students can reproduce a standard formulation, cannot be tested by applying a specific phrasing to a specific context, but only can be diagnosed by dialogue normally. And so the past focused knowledge as the content or the concept knowledge must be developed from one stage to another, not along the chronology, but from a scattered version, from a scattered idea, a scattered historical universe, which is maybe very incoherent, via a more coherent and maybe abstractable form of a historical universe to a reflective idea of historical universe. Sorry for being a bit over time. Thank you very much for attending and not protesting too early. I hope I did my task, and I am open for questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andreas, for your presentation and for the insights into the German context and into the FÜR model. All the participants can now send your questions into the chat. So please ask your questions in the chat now. Just to sum up a little bit the three keynotes we had. We had three different talks on the topic of knowledge, and all three speakers are here today in the meeting. Our first keynote in March was given by Arthur Chapman. He talked about the very popular concept of powerful knowledge. Andreas, you mentioned in your talk Michael Young, who made this concept so popular. In April, we had Carla van Boxtel talking about knowledge in the Dutch history curriculum, and now we had a German perspective. I would like to ask you, Andreas, or Carla or Arthur, you have been present in all the talks until now. Where do you see the differences in your understanding of knowledge?
That goes to me first?
Either yourself or I can. Yes, it goes to you first, and I'll unmute Carla and Arthur also if they wish to participate.
I'm not really sure whether I have many differences with the knowledge concept I learned from Arthur and from Carla. Maybe a bit that I'm skeptical against at least the original version of Michael Young's powerful knowledge, because my concept of knowledge focuses or stresses a bit more that even though knowledge is disciplinary and is developed within a disciplinary community, it is not knowledge developed by professionals, not the best knowledge thought in a field, or as Peter Seychers wrote once, the best story told in history, which can be powerful for students in order to to help them out of their maybe rather confined everyday life into the open world and open new horizons or something like that. But I think it's the relational part. I think we need this professional knowledge. We need this professional and academic versions, and even the versions in all the other instances of public history. But it's not that knowledge which is the power, but the relation makes the power. When I gave the graph of Tilman Grammis with the relational part with this triangle in the midst, I originally thought I should put some arrows to his double arrows and say this in the relation, in the interrelating of different types of knowledge lies the powerfulness. So that may be a bit of a difference. But maybe it's only a way of speaking that you say in some context that this disciplinary knowledge in itself is powerful. I think the powerful knowledge needs to be developed by the individual through learning, but that can only be done in Auseinandersetzung, in engaging with specific professional kinds of knowledge. So that may be one difference.
Okay, thank you. Carla or Arthur?
Yeah, perhaps I can add to that. Thank you, Andreas, for sharing your ideas. About similarities and differences, Andreas discussed the distinction between propositional knowledge and procedural knowledge, and I think that overlapped with the types that I discerned, but he especially emphasized the more general propositional knowledge, because you talked about transfer, that knowledge is especially transferable to other situations. But that raised the question for me, don't we also use more specific historical knowledge when we, for example, make comparisons between the past and the present, which is also historical thinking and reasoning, or when we discuss, for example, issues related to sensitive topics, such as, for example, the legacy of slavery, then we might use very specific historical knowledge about very specific historical events and so on. So there, I agree that the more general knowledge is especially important because it's more transferable, but there is the question which more specific knowledge is important or meaningful to incorporate in your curriculum. As a history teacher, you have to think about these questions. And I very much like the last part about the inward and outward. It made me think of the more sociocultural approach of learning and teaching, because you always think and reason with concepts, narratives, knowledge that is, of course, the product of society, and at the same time you contribute to it yourself. You renegotiate it again and again. So I think that's really an important issue. Thank you for emphasizing that.
Roland?
Yes.
May I just answer directly?
Yes, short.
Okay. Can you see my graph again?
Yep.
Okay. I think, Carla, what you said, the more specific knowledge, this kind of is what I would call knowledge about the past. And I think we need it in our, the two red or brown circles here. That is where in our historical thinking, we refer to other specific knowledge also. But it does not become part of the competence, but it is what the competencies are applied to. So in applying our competence, we can't do it without context. And of course, we need to compare to different instances of history, to different parts. And this is where we have to integrate, and where we have this historical universe ready in order to be able to think historically. But still, the competence in itself does not contain these, because they can be different each time. So there are maybe kind of what we call a Schnittstelle, kind of linking points between competencies and specific knowledge, of course.
Yeah, thank you.
Arthur.
Thank you, Andreas, for a characteristically stimulating and insightful presentation. I very much enjoyed that. Thank you. I don't think we do disagree, you know. I think we have lots of agreement, as Andreas was saying. A lot of it, maybe the differences are in differences of emphasis, but also differences of scope. I think the English tradition, for example, has learned a great deal from German approaches over the last 20 years, I think. One of the things we haven't spoken about very much that is a key figure in the model Andreas was talking about is the notion of orientation, for example. There was a lack of discussion of historical consciousness in English educational discourse until maybe 20 years ago, and it's still actually not the language that we necessarily would speak, and it's really vital, I think. So there are many things that that we can learn from each other, and I think there are many things in the German approach that that enhance and enrich what we do. But I think apart from that, the differences are maybe contextual and also of emphasis. So in England, competence has kind of been associated with 21st century skills, which have always been thought of as being generic rather than subject specific or specialized. So there's some resistance to some of the language, but that's just an accident of context. It's not an important point, really. If you wanted to talk about where there are slight differences of emphasis, I think maybe the differences simply arise from how we end up presenting things when we have to present them simply. So on the face of it, I might disagree with Andreas about the relational versus the conceptual change approach, but I don't think we actually do disagree. So I think it's really true that historical knowledge and insight by itself is of no use at all, because obviously it has to happen in the consciousness of an individual who's addressing significant problems like orientation problems, and not only of an individual, of a number of individuals in interaction. So I agree, of course, that simply to emphasize the importance of disciplinary knowledge without asking how it is integrated into someone's thinking and how that is used in communities to reflect on important problems, it would be silly, wouldn't it, to say that relations don't matter. So I'm grateful to Andreas for that. But I would also, however, disagree slightly, but it's only a question of emphasis, I think, on the notion of replacing or not replacing, children's thinking. So I accept, for example, that, the ideas that come in from academic disciplines, from everyday life, from your own past, these all have to be interrelated and integrated. But I would also want to argue that, ideas do get changed and ideas do get replaced. So, for example, I would hope that as a result of studying history, but not just history, the human sciences as well, that children's ideas about how we know and what we can know would change. I would also hope that as a result of studying these things, their ideas of who we are and who we can be would change. So this is where I guess in England, when we talk about progression, we have more of a kind of a sequence of levels of epistemic ideas, not just of integrative and relational modeling. So I don't know if I'm making much sense, but I think there's lots of overlap, lots of agreement, and the differences are largely just of emphasis. And actually, when we get away from trying to state things simply, we probably agree quite a lot anyway, even on those matters. But I would also emphasize again where I started, which is to say how much the different traditions supplement each other and enhance each other. So I think orientational approaches were not really a part of how the English spoke about history, and that's a real enhancement. I think in the book that I was presenting in my presentation, I finished my introduction by referring to Carla's model and saying how inspiring it was also because I'm very struck by the way that the work of Carla and her colleagues has been able to integrate things that we haven't integrated, so I think we agree more than disagree, in short.
Yes, maybe one word again. As for change, I think increasingly interrelating different concepts and different parts of knowledge changes your own knowledge. So I don't think it would be to just add to it. But if you know that up to or in my peer group, people think learning or history is like this, and I have an additional version, then I have a covering, and that changes my own perception. So I don't think it's about not changing, but you're not cutting off someone from his own path of learning or from the other groups he needs to interact with. So that is where I would of course agree that change is necessary, but change is building up more connections and of course transforming your own situation in it. Maybe that was not stressed enough in my presentation, but I would totally agree with you, Arthur.
Okay, thanks, Andreas. We have now a few questions in the chat, and I would ask you to give short answers. Lucas Pericleos asked, in many contexts, these ideas of developing competences related to understanding the interpretative nature of historical knowledge are considered to be a Trojan horse that aim to deconstruct national narratives and challenge national identities. This is partly the reason why in these contexts, traditional approaches of conveying the correct story of the past are still dominant. Could you tell us about whether this is the case in Germany too? And if not, why?
Okay, thanks, Lucas, for that question. A full-heartedly yes and no. I don't think we have at the moment in the mainstream a full national idea of we have to foster or to promote our national narrative among all our students. It may be a bit different with European consciousness. So we even have programs to foster European consciousness, and sometimes a bit of a European story, of an integrative story of Europe, at least up to a few years ago, was even pushed by state mandated. But of course, we also have these ideas of telling the correct story of the past and fostering national consciousness. On the one hand, on the far right of the spectrum, of the political spectrum, and on the other hand, we have those more, should I say, clad in a kind of epistemological naivete, saying you have to know the truth first before you can think. So I think in the German context, we are still a bit, and I'm glad that we are still a bit reluctant to say that we need to promote our German identity. And of course, the heterogeneity of nowadays German society plays a role in that. So from that on, we have, via this historical consciousness approach, we have a bit shifted from this stofforientiert, this subject matter teaching towards enabling students. But these arguments still come from different perspectives, but they are not as politically laden maybe as in England today.
Okay, thank you. Johannes Meyer-Hamme, who is here today with a group of students, says thanks for this interesting lecture. Could you explain a bit further what do you mean with three dimensions of historical knowledge? So what do you mean with three dimensions of historical knowledge?
Okay, Johannes, I think that either I said it wrong or you read it wrong. I mean 3 dimensions of historical education and historical learning. On the one hand, it's developing of competencies, so the abilities part. Then it's historical consciousness, developing and those need to be interrelated, of course, developing attitudes, insights, conceptions of the past and attitudes towards the past. And the third really is, and that maybe is something new for me, or people would not expect me to do. I think that we need to help students to build their own internal historical universe. They need not get one picture of the past, which they gain from one book, but they increasingly and refiguratively, successively need to build and rebuild an ever increased, ever more complex, but ever more flexible, maybe also, and relatable idea of what the past, whatever that may be, or this historical universe, I think Peter Gauchy's term is better than the past, is about. And so I think this is not one we can give them, but of course they need to build their idea of where they stand and how they are related to it. And they only can do it together with developing their competencies and together with developing their historical consciousness. And so I think we need, in a way, I should say 3 pillars. And we do not build one pillar first and then the other, but we need to build them so that the platform on the pillars is roughly level at each. But that picture is limited, again, that metaphor. Okay, was that clear?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I think 1 or 2 more questions. David Wagner asks or says, thank you, Andreas. Do you think that this implies a radical transformation of teaching methods towards more dialogic practices between teacher and students and between students?
Yes, and a small no. What I think is what we need is, at least we need reflective methods. We need methods where even though we cover a historical problem or historical question, some epoch, or we always need a phase where we reflect on how did we get there and what concept, what method did us carry us how far. We developed a kind of teaching model on the model of foreign language education, task-based learning, where they do not address the language directly, but they have tasks in everyday life, and afterwards they reflect on the language they use. And similarly, if we address some problem where we need to reflect on history, maybe we need to decide on whether we rename our school, and we have some candidates with the students, and they research these candidates whether you can rename your school, and afterwards we have to have at least afterwards we have to have a reflective phase where we among each other with the teacher, but we reflect on what was it, what we were doing, what helped us, what did not help us. And so this is a part of a dialogic practice. I don't think it needs to cover all the time. You may even have maybe a kind of a lesson where you get training in asking questions or training in, but you have to interconnect and to reflect on your own mental operations, not every now and then, regularly. That maybe would so a reflective more than a dialogic, but dialogue may be a tool for reflection. That's why I'm a bit reluctant. Okay.
Okay. Thanks very much, Andreas. There are still many questions in the chat, but we are out of time. Yeah, thanks for these inspiring insights you gave us, and also for the inspiring discussion. We were up to 140 people, and I'm sure everybody enjoyed your presentation and also the discussion. But we will now stop with the formal part. And I just want to announce that the next HEIRNET Keynote will be on the 2nd of June at 7:30 Central European Time and 6:30 British time. It's not yet clear who will be our next keynote speaker in June, but we will keep you informed, and the week before the date, at the latest, you will receive an email for the HEIRNET Keynote. Another time, if you just came later to this event, I put into the chat a list where you can sign up if you want to get more information about the keynote and about the HEIRNET conferences. Okay, so thanks very much. I will now start the breakout rooms. You can go into any breakout rooms you want to, and you can exchange with colleagues from all over the world. And I will leave them open as long as you want. So if you want to stay the whole night in the breakout rooms, which would you normally do probably when we have like such an event in real life, not virtual, then you can do it. I will leave in 30 minutes, but then another person, Andreas, will be the host, and we can just go on celebrating or whatever. So I'll create 5 breakout rooms, and you can choose in which room you want to go.